Good afternoon, everyone. Hope I'm audible enough. And I had to face some technical issues, so sorry for the delay. And in this session, I am going to talk about M. Hiryana's art experience along with Sri Aurobindo's The Poets of the Dawn 3 in the future poetry. And hope you are all interdisciplinary students, and I'm addressing the heterogeneous group. As you know that. English literature is a vast subject, and those who are interested in this literature, I hope you can understand what we are going to teach here. And let me start with M. Hiriana because we have a connection with this great literary critic because he belongs to Mysore. Let me start with Hiryana's brief background about Hiryana. M. Hiryana, he was a professor of Sanskrit at Maharaja's College, Mysore, and he is considered an outstanding authority over Indian philosophy and aesthetics who pioneered the study of these subjects in the 20th century. Hope I'm audible enough and you are following me what I'm saying. M. Hiryana was a professor of Sanskrit who was working in uh, Maharaja's College, Mysore, and he has a great authority over Indian aesthetics and Indian philosophy, and who also pioneered the study of these subjects in the 20th century because his name. He got name and fame because of his intellectual authority over philosophy and aesthetics. And let us see what he speaks in his art experience. I think it is a classical in the history of Indian philosophy, not only in Indian philosophy, even it also belongs to the English literature across the globe. So his scholarship was a fine blend of traditional Indian and modern Western learning. Famously, is when he wrote this, especially when he was described as a scholar who never wrote a useless word in his what whole book, but he preferred depth to width and synthesis to analysis. And the purpose of education, according to him, what he had believed, is not to inform the mind but to form it. I repeat, the purpose of education, according to M. Hiryana, was not to inform the mind but to form it. According to him, he says that the education or the purpose of education, the aim of education should form our mindset and it should bring a change in our way of thinking. So, it is the spirit of this thought that invariably animates all his writings. At the outset, it would be beneficial to briefly outline the nature of the time in which the professor wrote on Indian aesthetics, because in art experience, he talks about philosophy, aesthetics, and so many other things. And which, when he wrote this great classical work or a masterpiece, a brilliant masterpiece, I can say, it was a period when there was hardly any literature on the subject, and not just only in English, but even in regional languages of India. Hope you are following me. So when he wrote this what meritorious work, it was a period when there was hardly any literature on the subject of English, not only in English but also in regional languages of India. You know, we are all familiar with how many languages India has, right? We have in our country. So, if this was the case with the secondary literature, primary Sanskrit texts themselves were very hard to procure. So, although Bharata's Natya Shastra, which was published in 1894, Abhinava Gupta's monumental commentary thereon, Abhinava Bharati, which was published in 1926, so there was momentous work and what we can say the monumental works in the history of Indian aesthetics, Bharata's Natya Shastra and Abhinava Gupta's Abhinava Bharati, which was published in 1926. But still, M. Hiryana, by publishing his book Art Experience, he got his own unique name and fame. However, this was only the first volume. Starting then, it took 3 decades of scholarly effort to bring out the complete text of Abhinava Bharati. Because I am talking about Abhinava Gupta's monumental commentary on Abhinava Bharati. where it took almost 3 decades of scholarly effort to bring out this a seminal work, I can say. So the case with Anandavardhana's Dhvanyaloka, that is also very important. Before we should learn about art experience, we should be familiar with all these texts, right? So this too is unfortunately not free of errors, but still, in the case of Anandavardhana's Dhvanyaloka, it's another seminal treatise on poetics. Okay, this is considered as the another seminal treatise on Indian poetics, which is not at all different from other things. So it is in fact worse for its critical text that was made available nearly a century after its discovery, I think in 1877. Many other important texts were also available in manuscript form, waiting to be widely circulated and discussed. Anandavardhana Swanyaloka and Abhinava Bharati by what whom by whom I said Abhinava Gupta's got published. So if this was the scenario concerning the data available, the academic ambience too was not at all conducive for a scholar to take to the study of Alankara Shastra. Okay, you know the meaning of Alankara Shastra. Alankara in English is figures of speech, especially which beautifies, which decorates the poetic style by using that figures of speech or alankaras in Indian aesthetics. So this was a then scenario before M. Hiryana took up this seminal work to write. So on the contrary, it was singularly discouraging because I think in 1890, Max Muller, Max Muller, who was considered an authority over all subjects related to India, he has proclaimed, Max Muller, a great scholar of Indian philosophy and aesthetics, he proclaimed or he comments that the idea of the beautiful in nature did not exist in the Hindu mind. So he commented in his work that the idea of the beautiful nature, what India is known for, it did not exist in the Hindu mind. Hindu mind means the people who live in that, they have completely forgotten the idea how beautiful their nation is because they are not writing it in their, they are not describing it in their writing. This was the comment by the great scholar Max Muller. So, seeing in this background, we understand that Professor Hiryana had to painstakingly go through primary sources because he wanted to give an answer or give a reply to Max Muller's comment. And so keeping this in his mind, we can analyze or we can realize that how difficulty for Professor Hiryana to go through the primary sources and subject the material to a careful process of sifting and to build a solid case for Indian aesthetics. So this he did remarkably well because starting from I think 1919, the year in which he wrote his first essay on the subject, which was incidentally published in the proceedings of the first All India Oriental Conference, I repeat, in 1990, he wrote a remarkable, very interesting, very scholarly article, which was incidentally published in the proceedings of the first All India Oriental Conference till he passed away in 1950. So he wrote a series of articles that threw a flood of light on the Indian conception of beauty. That is, Indian conception of beauty. What is that? Alankara theory. So, for the first time, an Indian is writing about Indian aesthetics and philosophy. Till he passed away, he went on publishing articles after articles, which shed light on the great Indian conception of Alankara or beauty. So, usually, when the study of a subject is at an incipient stage, one does not expect to come across an essay or a book that succinctly summarizes all its quintessential tenets. So we are familiar with. Sometimes we could not able to expect that there is a seminal work or the meritorious work is coming on its way. So one does not expect to come across an essay or a book that succinctly summarizes all kinds of quintessential tenets. And such an attempt is reserved for a later stage where all its data points are systematically arranged and discussed from various perspectives by various scholars, multiple scholars. So, the study of Indian aesthetics here, the study of Indian philosophy or aesthetics, which was in such a stage when Professor Hiriyanna began writing on it. Hope I am audible enough. You are following me. Yeah. Then this is what we need to understand how Hiriana was a great scholar and how he used to write by uh, putting all his mind and soul into it. So he began writing on it on what Indian aesthetics for the first time in the history of Indian literature, not only in Indian literature, but even in English. So, but he had the outstanding acumen, I can say, to go to the heart, to get into the heart of the matter immediately. So, his book Art Experience advanced the study of Alankara Shastra. So, after listening to my lecture, hope you are understanding. This seminal work talks about what? Alankara Shastra or Indian aesthetics. By almost half a century, it can be considered as an advanced study on Alankara Shastras of India. So, needless to say that this is not a minor achievement or minor glorious thing, because we know it's how difficult. Only who are all thorough with this philosophy or aesthetics, they know the difficulty of writing in it. Just to read also, it consumes, expects lots of energy, patience, and what effort. Then just imagine to write, and the two to putting heart and soul into that work and making it as a seminal work and an advanced study on Alankara Shastra was a great achievement. So, of course, it is not just an achievement, but it is a major achievement. In forward, especially to the edition of this book, published by I think Dr. Kapila Vatyayan, and she published this book. In her forward, she says, "Let me read from her forward, Dr. Kapila Vatyayan." She says, each essay illuminates a fact of Indian aesthetics or an aspect of poetics. They are all like glowworms in night. So, each essay in this seminal work, Art Experience, a fact of Indian aesthetics or an aspect of poetics, they are all like glowworms in a dark night, flashes of insight in an inimitable style of conciseness, and pithy economy of verse, which means he is glorifying Indian aesthetics, but not writing a lengthy sentences. Instead, he is putting a standard, highly standard words with a style of conciseness, okay, in a condensive form. So there is no weight of heavy or cumbersome scholarship, footnoting or referencing, so on. So they thus stand a class apart from all those others whose work is characterized by erudition and information. For the reader, be he a Sanskritist or not, he is not a Sanskrit scholar, they make engaging reading and are full of contemporary relevance. This is what Kapila Vatyayan says in her forward to the edition of this book. Or she says, the final lines are very interesting. The final line is very interesting, where she says, "For the reader, be he or she a Sanskrit scholar or not, they make engaging reading and are full of contemporary relevance." And so, Professor Hiriana's insights insights into Indian aesthetics. What may be the insights, his insights into Indian aesthetics? So here we have, as I told you, that they have so many articles that contain the core of this thoughts on the Alankara Shastra, right? Hope I am audible enough. As I said, so the articles that contain, as I was discussing about, the articles which contain the core of his thoughts on the subject in this book are four essays from the art experience. One is art Indian aesthetics 1 and 2, and art experience 1 and 2. Okay, Indian aesthetics 1 and 2, and art experience 1 and 2. These are the first, what I can say, the four essays we can have in this book. Indian Aesthetics 1 and 2 and Art Experience 1 and 2. So the whole book is prescribed for you in this semester. I mean, Iliana's Art Experience. So here we can have in the first lecture on the topic, the quest after perfection. The first lecture on the topic, like the quest after perfection, wherein he discusses truth, goodness, and beauty. Okay, wherein he discusses truth, goodness, and beauty, and the essay titled Beauty in Art in his magnum opus work, Indian Conception of Values. Okay, so the quest. Hope you are following me. The first lecture on this topic was the quest after perfection, wherein he discusses truth, goodness, and beauty. These are the three essential things he focuses on. And the essay titled "Beauty in Art" in his magnum opus work, Indian Conception of Values. In all these articles, M. Hiriyana primarily focuses on the fundamental tenets of Alankara Shastra, Indian aesthetics. Got it? In all these articles, he primarily focuses on the fundamental tenets of Alankara Shastra, which draws support from masters such as Bharata, Anandavardhana, Abhinavagupta, Vyasa, Valmiki, Kalidasa, and Bhavabhuti. These are the greatest masters of Indian aesthetics and philosophy, I can say, and they are well versed in philosophy as well as Alankara Shastras. They belong to India. So he primarily focuses on Alankara Shastra by getting support from all these great scholars of Indian theatre and arts. I can say to begin with Bharata, Anandavardhana, Abhinavagupta, Vyasa, Valmiki, Kalidasa, and Bhavabhuti. So a usual charge leveled against Indian aesthetic is that philosophers in India did not develop aesthetic theories as was the trend in the West. So Professor M. Hiriyana, he replied to this allegation by citing counterexamples from philosophical texts such as Sankhya Karika and Vedanta Panchadasi. Okay, so in his two seminal work, he counter examples from philosophical texts that such as Sankhya Karika and Vedanta Panchadasi. So more importantly, he showed in these work how Alankara Shastra in India developed independent of philosophy. They developed their own independent philosophy as an autonomous science and thereby carved a special niche for itself. Okay, so as an autonomous science and thereby carved a special niche for itself by focusing that, by showing that how Indian Alankara Shastra is completely different and independent. So, if philosophy, according to him, if philosophy were to be squared with aesthetics, there would be as many theories of art as there are theories of reality, or leading to an endless spiral of confusion. Thus proceeds his infallible argument. What was that argument? He wanted to show it on because there are, according to him, there are, if philosophy were to be squared with aesthetics, there would be as many theories as related to the theory of reality. So by all this, it should not be understood that Professor Hiriyana criticized Westerners alone and accepted everything Indian has got. It doesn't mean that he goes on criticizing or attacking the Western scholars by focusing on his Indianness or Indian Alankara Shastra. Nothing can be farther from truth, as we all know, for he was very much aware of the lapses or lacunas or shortcomings in our Indian tradition. He was very much aware of the drawbacks of Indian or lacunas in Indian tradition. For instance, he openly criticizes the undue popularity enjoyed by a mere primer of poetics like Prataparudriyas, or there are something like Prataparudra, Yashobhushana. These are the other books at the cost of Dhvanyaloka, which is a sui generis in Indian aesthetics, because he finds out minor mistakes in such a seminal works or poetics like Prataparudriya or Prataparudra Yashobhushana. This is at the cost of Dhvanyaloka. Who wrote Dhvanyaloka? I think Anandavardhana's Dhvanyaloka. Yeah. Then he also says that how even he was very much aware of what was lacking in Indian tradition or Indian aesthetics. He wanted to concentrate on it, and that we can say that it was Professor M. Hiriyana who, for the first time, provided a clear answer to question why can't the Vedas be considered as works of poetry? Because you know, and we all know that Vedas are written in a poetic form, right? Though they are hymns, though they are what we base a solid base for in Hinduism, but still he questions and he has an answer that why can't the Vedas be considered as a good works of poetry? It is because that, said the professor, he says, the Vedas are primarily God centric, Deva Kendrita. You know, in Sanskrit translation, God centered means Deva Kendrita. It is centered around, it centers in Almighty. So when somebody asked him why your Vedas cannot be considered as the works of art or works of poetry, his answer was Vedas were primarily God-centric or Deva Kendrita, whereas the poetry proper is human-centric, right? In poems, actually, hymns are meant for the gods, whereas poems, small songs or lyrics, they are meant for the human. So they are human centric. So the line that separate both Vedas and poetry is that the bhakti or devotion and rakti. Rakti means desire or affection or loveliness. So to speak is that one that democrates Veda and Kavya. So he says that this is just one line which separates both Veda and Kavya or Veda and poetry, is that a bhakti or devotion. So this is how his knowledge, we can it is just an incident or just an example how intellectual he was and how he had such a kind of time, what we can say that he knew how to answer in a scholarly way, that too in a convincing way. And what is, hope you are all familiar with how he differentiate between Veda and Kavya. Kavya means poetry. So, regarding the difference between beauty in nature and beauty in art, he decisively explains that while the former, while the beauty, because he in the same book he also tries to bring a difference between beauty in nature and beauty in art. So he decisively explains that while the beauty may arouse from some practical interest in the beholder, as great John Keats John Keats says, beauty lies in beholder's eyes, right? In a great of in his famous poem, The Ode on a Grecian Urn, he says, beauty lies in beholder's eyes. So he also tries to explain beauty. According to him, that it may arouse some practical interest in the beholder. The latter can never do so. The latter means the beauty in art. It can never do so by just looking into the work of art or poetry. We cannot feel very impressive, right? So, in his own words, a person admiring the science beauty, or sorry, the scenic beauty, a person admiring the scenic beauty of a mountain may conceivably be diverted from it at any moment by the thought of some purpose, say, of making the place fit for a health or holiday resort. Okay, fit for health or holiday resort, like how we admire the nature, the beauty in nature. Okay, for mountain or sometimes a river, stream, and hillocks, hills. So he says it may be conceivably be diverted from it any moment by the thought of some purpose, say of making the place fit for the health or holiday resort. It may thus become the focus of a different kind of interest, where but no such diversion of interest is conceivable in the case of art, because its object is unreal. Okay, I hope you are following me. So it may thus become the focus of a different kind of interest, but no such diversion of interest is conceivable in the case of art, because its object is not real. So this explanation we can have in The Quest After Perfection, I think in page number 70 and so on. So he further continues saying that by explaining the beauty in nature and beauty in art, nature, even at its best, contains irrelevant features. And we can't say that only beautiful things are in nature. Even there are also some irrelevant features are also there. So if not so ugly and disagreeable ones, but still nature contains some irrelevant features. To paint a landscape is more than to photograph it. He says the painter does not reproduce it as it is, but as his imagination represents. Uh, Actually, has his imagination makes him to reproduce it by leaving the drawbacks or by taking away the irrelevant things in his painting. So in the other words, the artist never copies the given thing mechanically, but idealizes it, and in his idealization lies the secret of his art. This is what he says in Art Experience. uh, Okay, in this book he tries to brings the difference between beauty in nature and beauty in art, and how nature consists not only beautiful things but also irrelevant features. But the beauty in art lies where the artist, he does not produce as it is the nature, but uh, what I can say, he just leaves the irrelevant thing and he presents it in his own imagination way. So that's why the artist never copies the given melancholy or the given thing in a mechanical way. Instead, he idealizes it, and in this idealization lies the creativity of art, or the secret of his artistic skill. And then he also continues, it was also because of Professor Hiriana who, for the first time, provided a cogent or rather cogent argument for the consideration of beauty as a value. He did it with the light of Advaita Vedanta, which speaks of Jivan Mukti. Jivan Mukti means liberation. Okay, liberation of what? Liberation of a soul. Okay, so he write this seminal work who was deeply influenced or inspired by Advaita Vedanta, which speaks of Jivan Mukti, that is liberation, liberation from all kinds of ties and here and now, especially on the earth. So the tersi means, I can say, the gist of Hiriana's prose here is that the gravitas of the subject necessitate quoting his new or quoting his view on this in his art experience in this book. Let me read out those lines. Beauty in nature, then, as we commonly understand, is anything but brings about a break in the routine life. Okay, what he says, what he tries to say, beauty in nature, as we commonly understand, is nothing or is anything which brings about a break in the routine life and serves as a point of departure towards the realization of light and the true delight. which it should satisfy. But what is the significance of this break? Generally we lead a life of continuous tension, bent as we are upon securing aims, more or less personal in character. So what we want to do in this break, in because everyone, we human beings, it's quite common to take a break in our monotonous life. So in this break, what we are supposed to do, or what we wish to do, generally we lead a life of a tension free life, right? Continuous tension. But as we are upon securing aims or more or less personal in character, in Shankara's words, life is characterized by avidya kama karma. Okay, according to Shankaracharya, he also, because I told you, Hirana was basically influenced by Advaita Vedanta, which was proposed by Shankaracharya. So according to Shankaracharya's words, life is characterized by three important things, that is avidya kama karma, which is desire and strive, arising out of the ignorance of the ultimate truth. So when we are not actively engaged, we may feel this tension relaxed, and but that feeling of relaxation comes, is somewhat like deceptive, for even then self-interest persists, maybe within the experience of our own personal experience. So he says that delight means the transcending of even this inner strain. So the absence of desire then is the determining condition of pleasure. So what kind of pleasure he is speaking about? Just he wanted to, he wished to, he means we all human beings wish to take a pleasure during our break. So and its presence that of pain in order to forget the pain. So the absence of desire may be due to any cause, whatever, to a particular desire. He says that the absence of desire may be due to any cause, whatever, to a particular desire having been gratified, or to there being for the time nothing to do, desire. So the chief thing is that the selfish attitude of the mind, of a human mind, he is talking about of a human mind. So the chief thing is that the selfish attitude of a human mind is the egocentric predicament. Okay, egocentric predicament, which must be transcended at least temporarily, transcended at least temporarily, at a point of detachment, and a point of detachment which has to be reached before we can enjoy happiness. So he talks about joy now. What is joy? Joy or bliss is the intrinsic nature of the self according to the Vedanta. Joy or bliss is the intrinsic nature of the self according to the Vedanta, that being the significance of describing the ultimate reality as Ananda. Ananda means joy or a bliss. According to Vedanta, it tells us about the significance of describing the ultimate reality, that is the Ananda or desire, or we can say happiness or bliss. So the break in the routine in life, he says, every human being wish to take a break in their monotonous life or a mechanical life. So during that break, what does it, how does it perform? So the break in the routine life restores this character to the self. So the soul or the self of a human being, it starts enjoying that, or it is in pursuit of joy or bliss. So, if its intrinsic nature is not always manifest, so it is because desire veils it. Desire always veils their real manifest, the real self. When this veil is stripped off, veil means it's covered. The ananda is covered by the self ego or self interest or so many things. When this veil is stripped off, no matter how the real nature of atma asserts itself, and we feel the happiness, which is all our own. So we should realize, we should understand our inner self. That's what the greatest of people say, no? If you understand the other people, your friends, you can win the world. But if you understand yourself, then you can win the whole world, whole this thing, the universe. So that's why even I think Hiriana also tries to teach us the same thing. When the veil is stripped out or stripped off, no matter how the real nature of Atma asserts itself, and we feel the happiness which is all our own. So in the case of Jnana, Atma, Jnana means knowledge, right? The true source of this delight is known to Jnana. So, but even when such enlightenment is lacking, we may experience some similar kind of delight when we have gained knowledge, right? Or enhance our knowledge. Or when we become intellectuals, or when we, how do we become intellectuals? Only by reading texts, right? Or by reading or by visiting so many places and by experiencing. So we may enjoy while it we do not know the exact meaning of delight or ajnana or atma, the importance of soul. To use Shankaracharya's words again, the ever recurring series of karma or karman or interest and activity constitutes life. So the elimination of karma and karman while their cause avidya continues in a latent form marks the aesthetic feeling or aesthetic attitude of a human being. So the dismissal of avidya even in this latent form marks the saintly attitude. So one has to dismiss the avidya even in his latent from marks the which marks the saintly attitude of a person. Thus the artistic attitude is one of disinterested contemplation but not of true delightment or true enlightenment, while the attitude of the saint is one of true enlightenment and disinterestedness, but not necessarily of passivity. So we should not be passive always, we should be active. So these enlightenment or of avidya, or by ignoring avidya or by dismissal of avidya, any artistic attitude is one of the, I can say, disinterested contemplation, but not of true enlightenment, while the attitude of the saint is one of the true enlightenment and disinterestedness, but it is not considered or not due to passivity. So the two attitudes thus resemble each other in one important aspect, that is unselfishness. Okay. I think I can say that selflessness. One should have selflessness. He or she should not be self-interested. So, according to Professor Hiriyanna, again, we can say that he is or he was of the firm opinion that the cardinal characteristic feature of art is the transcendence of all purposes. This is what he tried to say in his book. What is the cardinal characteristic feature of art? It is the transcendence of all the purposes, estimating its value, that estimating of transcendence of art or the great features of art. He says that art experience is well adapted to arouse our interest in the ideal state by giving us a foretaste of it, and thus to serve as a powerful incentive to the pursuit of that state. So, by provisionally, sometimes by provisionally fulfilling the need felt by man for restful joy, art experience may impel him to do his utmost to secure such joy finally. This is what he says in the beginning chapters of art experience, how one can attain freedom, or how one somebody can be someone or the soul of someone, human beings can attain what, the restful joy he tries to focus on. That's why art experience may impel him, especially him, he is referring to a human being, to do his utmost to secure that ananda or joy or bliss finally. So similarly, he called art layman's yoga. So, what does he say? According to him, any kind of art, whether it's a painting, dancing, coloring, singing, or even writing, he says it is a layman's yoga, and also wrote that in his typical tone of authoritative. Finally, he says art is a shortcut to the ultimate value of life by passing logic. So great words. He says, art is a shortcut to ultimate value of life, bypassing logic. So, in order to attain your joy or ananda or bliss, you should not no need to follow hard and fast rules, or you should not be very highly intellectual. Sometimes, just you should you should be a you should be an artist of any kind. So, according to him, art is a shortcut to reach your ultimate goal of your life, bypassing logic. So, this is what he tries to say. Then, to seek harmony in all kinds of spheres of existence is a natural desire of all of us, as Professor Hiriana beautifully brought to the light of Indian idea of accomplishing this, not by extinguishing interest, but through refinement of feeling and cultivation of emotion. He says that there should not be just refinement of feeling, but also there should be a moderation of emotion or cultivation of emotion. So, speaking of the relationship between art and morality, he posited in his inimitable epigrammatic style what he says: art should not have a moral aim. So, being an artist, you should not be no need to be highly moral in your view, but most necessarily have a moral view. You should not be so moral aim. So that's why he says, one any kind of artist, he should not have a moral aim, but he should have a moral view. This is what he tries to say. Then, on a related note, he also observes that art, rightly conceived, cannot be merely a selfish escape from life. Nor is it a pleasant luxury, it is a discipline, albeit it is a pleasant and must influence life permanently, or at least tend to do so. So this is what he talks about Indian conception of values here. He also argues that the great poetry must essentially deal with purusharthas. You know the purusharthas meaning how our Vedas speak about purusharthas. So he says a great poetry must essentially teach or deal with purusharthas, though theoretically the theme of art may be anything which has a basis in life. This additional requirement that purusharthas makes it necessary to restrict the scope of the artist of his own choice to the higher aspects of life. Otherwise, art not only ceases to exert any moral influence, it may turn out, in the end, to a means of corrupting character. Okay, he again, we can have this dialogue in Indian conception of values. So in all his writings, we can say that Professor Hiriana, he threw light on those aspects of the subject matter which usually create doubts in the media or in the minds of students. As an example, we can consider his explanation on the term rasa. The word rasa primarily means taste or savor, such as sweetness or bitterness or sour, like that. And by a metaphorical extension, if you go according to the metaphorical meaning of this, it has been applied to aesthetic experience. So the point of the metaphor is that, as in the case of a taste like sweetness, there is not such kind of sweet rasa. Rasa means, according to Indian aesthetics, Professor Hirena, it's an emotion. This apart from directly experiencing the sweetness, it says rasa is always suggested, but suggestion is not always of rasa. So this has to be understood in the sense that although the suggestion can manifest itself in I think three ways. One is vastu, alankara, and rasa. Okay, so the art experience can be just what sensed through suggestions that can be manifest in itself in three ways: vastu, which means fact based; alankara, which is imaginative; and rasa, which means emotional. So apart from rasa dhvani theory, the rest may not always bring about aesthetic relation immediately. So there are numerous passages in this book which deals with ancient texts related to poetics, and that on the first glance appear prescriptive, but are truly descriptive in nature. A superficial examination of these might lead This might lead one to the incorrect conclusion that Sanskrit poets worked with, I can say that, stultifying rules that did not allow them to freely express themselves. So, speaking of this again, Professor Hiriana, he clarifies that they are to be looked upon, to quote his words, they are, on which he is talking about the rasas or the delight. They are to be looked upon more as aids in appraising the worth of a poem than as restraints placed upon the freedom of a poet. This is what he tries to clarify in this term. And to conclude, Professor Hiriana was never a blind adherent of tradition. What he wrote of the Indian civilization is also true of him. And he says, when a new stage of progress is reached, the old is not discarded, but is consciously incorporated in the new. Like T.S. Eliot, even he also tries to connect the gap between past and the present. So it is this critical conservation, what he says, though there is a stage of a progress of a new, the old is not discarded, but it should be consciously incorporated in a new thing. So it is this critical conservatism which marks or makes Indian civilization as a whole, which explains its stability and constitutes its special strength. So he spoke about this in his popular essays in Indian philosophy. So he also had some revolutionary ideas, such as, for instance, his suggestion to replace religion with art, and in accordance with the context of the modern world. He also poses or posited that poetry is a criticism of life, which is nearer to philosophy than science or religion. He says poetry is criticism of life, which is nearer to philosophy than to science or religion. And according to him, to mix art and religion is only to make the latter attractive. However, such endeavors have rescued art from hopeless degeneration. Okay, so we can also find that Alankara Shastra is the virginal sources which dwell with the first studied by Professor M. Hiriyana, and Sanskrit texts related to aesthetics are also full of definitions and hair-splitting arguments, we can say, about classification and subclassifications of Sanskrit texts. So much so that Dr. S.K. Day, he himself a doyen of the subject, he famously remarked that it is like reading a catalog than reading the actual text. Okay, he is a great scholar on Sanskrit text. He himself says like that. So finally, Hiriyana was both the inspiration for and the guiding force behind the work Bharatiya Kavya Mimamsa, which means Indian. He is the writer of Indian Aesthetics, which written by his pupil Professor T.S. Shrikantaya, popularly known as Teenam Shri. We are all familiar with him, no? So he written exquisite prose. This work is a classic of modern Kannada, and even Professor Shrikantaya, he sat at the feet of his guru and took lessons on Vanyalokra to muster the confidence required to write an analytical history of Indian poetics. So, as we Kannadigas and as a lovers of literature and an ardent advocates of Indian aesthetics and philosophy, whose appeal is universal, we must remember Professor M. Hiriyannaya with great respect and with a great respectful attitude and loving reverence. Thank you. Hope I made myself clear. Thank you.
Hello, dear students. A very warm good afternoon to all our students of Karnataka State Open University. I welcome you to this third session class, the third hour. Remember, you all are second year students, second semester students, and you have chosen open elective Indian literature too. In second semester we have introduced this paper, that's interdisciplinary course 2, where you have Indian literature. In the earlier semester, in the first semester, and you students of other branch of studies, students from other languages, student from social science, student from science background, the commerce and the management, and you all have taken up this subject, open elective Indian literature 1 in the first semester. So here as Indian literature 2, hopefully the term. So I am the chairperson, Dr. Nataraju from Karnataka State Open University, English department. I believe that by now you all have this, a preliminary notion of what is Indian literature is all about. Because I believe all of you are from other branch of studies, and most of you have not read many texts of Indian literature, and some have might have read some novels, poetry, drama confined to Indian literature. So, what is this concept called Indian literature? Why do we have to read this? What is this motto? What is the fundamental questions about Indian literature is all about? We the Department of English have introduced English literature the way we include the British literature, in our MA program. But for this specific open elective Indian literature, so we had some kind of objectives. We have some notion towards, yes, Indian literature should be should be reached to this a non-literary student. Could be social science students, could be like other commerce and management student. So you all have done your first semester. Hope you have enjoyed the first semesters. The text like. The writers like Nehru's autobiography and Kalidasa Sakuntala and many other texts. And in the second semester, you people in Indian literature too, you have the writers like Girish Karnad's, the play called Hayavadana, and you have Guru Charan Das, Larin Saheb. These are two plays, Natakagalu, they are in Indian plays. And we have Mr. Hiriyana's art experience and Arabindo's, the two chapters. Arabindo is known for a book called The Future Poetry. So the future poetry he writes, and here there are two chapters. One is the Poets of the Dawn 2 and the Poets of the Dawn 3. Probably you might have read this essay much earlier for your examination preparations. So today in my class, I'll take up this essay, that is the Poets of the Dawn 2, the where it is an excerpt. It's a chosen part by the book The Future Poetry by Arabindo. So what is this all about? What is Arabindo he's talking about? What is the main intention? What are the future directions of directions of Arabindo in this entire text? This is all about. And much before you understand Indian literature, you have to understand, there are the notion called to appreciate artistic values in Indian literature. And you people have to understand, to appreciate the artistic values of Indian literature. So how Indian writers have written the text with some sort of artistic values. What are the writing craftsmanship, the writing ability, the uniqueness of the writing, the art craftsmanship, artistic values that you should understand while reading this Indian literature. Our own Indian writers artistic process and artistic creation and artistic values. And apart from that, you should also understand the importance of Indian English plays. When you talk about Indian plays, you should also know the importance of Indian writers too. And after that, you have to understand the aesthetics experience of the art written by Hiriyana. And after that, here Arabindo has a critic. Arabindo here, he is with us here in this text, that is, the Poets of the Dawn too. Arabindo, he is here has a true critic. So now the question is, what is the role of a critic? What does the role, how does a critic takes an important role in being, a critic? Whom do we call as a critic? For example, here Aurobindo he's assessing two important romantic poets. One is the Byron and William Wordsworth. These two poets are assessed by Aurobindo's. So Aurobindo, what method does he follow to assess the poets? Dear students, hope my voice is audible. The morning there were some internet connections, and we regret the inconvenience, and hope the voice is clear, the audio is clear, and you people are listening here. I believe that. So coming back to this, so if this is a criticism, for example, we have a literary genre, what we call sahitya the prakaragalu in Indian literature or Western literature. For example, we have poetry, drama, novel, literary criticism as well. So vimarsha is also another part of another the facets of literary genre, the criticism. So here, Aurobindo's this text, that is the Poets of the Dawn too, it is exclusively meant for criticism. That means that Aurobindo he is going to criticize some rap poets. Whom is he criticizing? How does he criticizing? How does he put forth his visions? How does he put forth his directions in criticizing them? There is one method called a judicious criticism. For example, if a person criticizes other person, he has to apply this judicious criticism. Whatever his remarks, his findings, his opinion are to be judiciously be put forth. They should have their own genuine point. They should have their own genuine viewpoints in in assessing or is put forth his viewpoints on any poets. So why the question is why Aurobindo he is keen observer of romantic poets. When we talk about Indian English poets like romantic poets like William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge and the Byron and P.B. Shelley and John Keats, and Aurobindo being an Indian poet, being an Indian critic, and he's talking about the Western philosopher, Western writers, Western poets. That is the core question that you all have to understand. I repeat again, and Aurobindo, the being an Indian poet, the being an Indian critic, he's assessing the Western poets. So the future poetry of the text, it is talks about, it is a collection or it's a document of criticism that made by Aurobindo on English romantic poets. So this is the first thing that should come to your mind when you understand the what Aurobindo is going to talk about. Okay, this is the fundamental question that you all have to aware of. So now, come back to this, the entire text, the Poets of the Dawn 2. There are two essays I told you, the Poets of the Dawn 2 and the Poets of Dawn 3. Dawn 3 will be taken by other teacher, and the Poets of the Dawn 2 will be, I am going to discuss here in this platform too. So now, the idea is before we understand this essay, one thing that you should understand: what are the future directions or the development of poetry? What are the the component in poetry? What are the subject matters of poetry? How a poem should be written? The merits and demerits, and then what the directions is Aurobindo is going to give us. And after that, you will understand in the entire essay, Aurobindo he happens to be a critic of judicious assessment. Whatever his assessment on romantic poets, it is a true criticism on romantic poets. So now, by now, hope you have some sort of idea about what is this entire text is all about. Sri Aurobindo's the future poetry, the way we are going to learn about the poets of the Dawn too. So now we should understand who is this Sri Aurobindo. What is the importance about him? The important thing about Aurobindo is he's one of the most well-known and the versatile of the Indian poets in English. And he's the versatile, a very important and a well-known Indian poet. Aurobindo is a poet who writes poetry in English. That is important, though that's why we call it as Indian writing in English. And we have a separate title is given as Indian literature. The way. Um, you have come across the different writers from the different states and different languages, they have written. And ultimately, this is an umbrella term called Indian literature and Indian writing in English. Indian writing in English, it is written in English language. And Indian literature, it holistically applies that, all the languages in Indian languages literature. So here, but exclusively Aurobindo, he writes only in English language. That is the important thing that you should remember. So here, Aurobindo, he wrote substantially on yoga. He talks about the spiritual component. And the purpose that we introduce this course to understand the value based education in Indian literature, and how Indian literature propagates or extends some value-based information towards, probably between, the spirituality, or the philosophy, or the intuition, or the individual values, or the societal norms, societal values and tradition. In a way, we understand that, the whole this essay of Aurobindo's, it talks about the yoga, the spirituality, the philosophy of Indian, the basic philosophy that we understand, the fundamentals of philosophy and Indian literature. And then, so wrote substantially on yoga and spiritual poetry. So he writes on spiritual poetry, and he talks about the yoga and philosophical works like the life of divine and the life of yoga. So divinity is a part and parcel of the writings of Aurobindo. For example, the moment you think about Arabindo's writing styles, you immediately talk about, yes, he talks about the divinity, he talks about the spirituality, he talks about the philosophy, and he talks about the yoga issues. That means there is something called, this is, the true kernel of human life, the true kernel of humanitarian society, the humanitarianism. So all these concepts are much more interwoven in the writings of Aurobindo. He also wrote the ideal of human unity and the human cycle, which are the sociological and political in nature. So he also wrote an important text like the ideal of human unity and the human cycle. And he's also deliberated on our scriptures in essays on Gita. He writes about songs, and the secrets of Veda. He talks about the Veda, and he talks about the future poetry, and what are the directions of future poetry should be, what poetry should be evoke, what poetry should extend some information, what poetry should direct. Because the entire sahitya, what you say, literature, it is reflections of society. Whatever we see in society, we could see in literature. So ultimately, literature, it projects the human values and life of our community and our society. That one thing they should all remember. So he wrote on this concept, and he also wrote on an epic known called Savitri. Is a very popular among his works, and revealing Aurobindo as a yogi and a philosopher. So his texts, that is the Savitri, are the very popular among his, the works. It reveals Aurobindo as a yogi and the philosopher. So this is the introduction about Aurobindo's the writing craftsmanship, writing efficiency, and writing styles. And after that, when we talk about the entire essay, there is one thing you should always remember. That is, the poetry should always leads us to the highest, the realization. That is one thing he comments in his poetry. What is this realization? It is the spiritual realization, or it is the that highest realization of human life, or is this the spiritual vision? So these are the things that he talks about in his poetry, in this text. To Aurobindo, a poem or a poet should transport, the poet, either poem or a poetry should transport a reader to a level of higher realization. But the moment you read some sort of literary text, that should take you to the highest realization. So we understand that here Aurobindo is talking about reading is an essential part and parcel of everyone's life. And the right reading is also important. Reading is not just sufficient, right reading is sufficient. So what is this right reading? Right reading, it is a contemplations of human soul. The whatever that you're reading, whatever the opinions that you put forth, it is a value judgment. It is a value based one. So that is the power of reading. That is the power of literature. So here we could see the how here the Aurobindo, he the mouth speak, is voicing the entire the canon called literature has a very powerful tool, and which can destroy the community, or which can protect community, which can it can restore the values of human life. That is the right reading or the wrong reading. So the writing is a very powerful tool, and literature is a very powerful tool. And because when we talk about the literary canon literature, we have a good books and we have the bad books. We have because some writings are propensic, they talk about what not supposed to be spoken, but some texts are completely banned. That's why I said that right reading or the wrong reading, or good books or bad books. Some books are to be banned is because they're provocative in nature. And whereas here Arabindo's notion called notion of the fundamental notions of the reading happens to be the highest to the value based one, and your viewpoints are the best one. So the why he's he commenting these romantic poets, this is very important, they should understand. Because romantic poets are the English romantic poets are the one who glorifies nature, who surrendered themselves to the nature, who one with the nature, who they're much more like a philosophers. When you read Wordsworth poetry, he is a pantheist, who finds God in nature. So romantic poets, even John Keats also, he treat his notion called Satyam Shivam Sundaram. The beauty is truth beauty. So these poets, and even Shelley's for that matter, the west wind is a preserver and the destroyer. So the concept of God, revival of the beauty, nature, spirituality, philosophy are much more interwoven in the writings of romantic poets. I think that's the reason why he's talking about, he's taking up being an Indian poet, talking about the romantic poets of Western literature, the British literature. So he comments. How does he comment? As I told you that for Arabindo, a poem or a poet should transport a reader to a level of higher realization. There should be realization ultimately. That is the the four questions of the poetry is all about. And according to him, a poetry of spiritual vision and the sense of things behind life and above all intellectual must similarly develop from its essence a characteristics voice. So, according to him, a poetry happens to be the spirit. Poetry must have a spiritual vision. So that we could see in his criticism. So after that, when let us get back to his essay. So far I gave my introductory remark, introduction about romantic. I mean Harabindo's Harabindo's text. And here, there is one thing that we should also remember. That is here, Aurobindo, he is aiming to present a vision of universe and the divine life too. So Arabindo's vision in his future poetry, he is the vision of universe. So the vision of universe and the divine life, that is they're the core questions of human life. So this dictum, this doctrine, it is the much more spreaded, it's interwoven in this entire the text, that is the future poetry. And let us see how Aurobindo he unveils, he discusses these two romantic poets. So in your mind, you should keep in your mind Arabindo's the poets of the dawn too. It's on the two poets of romantic poets. That's the Byron and William Wordsworth. So Sri Aurobindo focuses on the writings of Byron and William Wordsworth. So there are two poets. So here Aurobindo, he's criticizing or he's assessing. He makes an assessment about their poetry. ಅವರ ಕವಿತೆಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ he talks about. And what does he say? Let us see how you know Aurobindo talks about these poets like Byron and William Wordsworth. So here, Aurobindo focuses on the writings of Byron and William Wordsworth. He begins the discussion by suggesting that the modern poets lacked the ability to transport the reader to a higher level of realization. For example, the modern poets, the 20th century poets, Their subject matters is that, how the entire modern civilization, it is, degenerating, how the spiritual lackness, how the, the civilization or themselves is degenerated, where there is no hope for living, where there is no identity for a common man, where people are just treated as a machine, the mechanized way of life. So here, the poets of modern 20th century, they lacked in this, highest level of realization. They only talk about the, the modern, the essentials of 21st century. They only talk about the essentials of 21st century, or they all these necessities are the highest, the prerogative. The necessities of 21st century are the highest, the prerogative. The why this modern poet, they do not talk about the conditions of the common man, conditions of common man, or, the, I mean, why don't they talk about the values of human society, the values of human life? So Sri Aurobindo, he focuses on the writings of Byron and William Wordsworth, and he begins the discussion by suggesting that the modern poets, they lacked the ability to transport the reader to a higher level of realization. So this is his first point, in his approach. And some definitions are there in the study material. For example, a poetry whose task is to render truth of the spirits by passing behind the appearance. So here, the highest realizations of poetry. What poets should evoke? What poetry are they to instruct? Because poetry, they should instruct the whole human society. They should give some message to the human life, right? So this is, in a way, here, Aravindo, he's talking about the basic fundamentals of poetry, the doctrines of poetry, to reach the, human society, to give some message to human society. So Sri Aurobindo feels, in order to usher in intensity of the deeper truth and the vision, could choose one of the following three methods. He advocates three different kinds of methods in terms of assessing a man's intellectuality. For example, when you talk about the poetry, you have how the poetry has been written, the diction, the based on the language that you talk about, and based on the, the transfigure of the language that you talk about, and use of, the kind of, the, the object and the language. So you assess a poem, use of their language. So language is a very important in poetry. So it talks about the, as I told you, two English poets, that is, but these poets came into an age of imperfect, unenriched and incomplete intellectuality. So Arabindo, he says that these two poets, the era that they've come, the era they appear in the canon of literature, in the romantic literature, that was a time of, imperfect. That was a time of unenriched and the time of incomplete intellectuality. They reached in the era, they appear on the era the where, there was not but the perfect and enriched or a complete intellectuality. No. Then what about the, the language of these two poets? Sri Aurobindo states that the poetry produced during that period, did exhibit sparks of genuine poetry. Of course, their poetries are so genuine. And here, what does he say here? There comes in some absolute moments a native voice of the spirit. They could able to talk about the own nativity of the entire British society. So they only concentrate on the a native voice of the spirit in Wordsworth, revelations of the spiritual presence in nature and its scenes of the people. He talks about the nature and the people. There is poets are some only a subjective poetry means, the poet who talks about his, the personal details. For example, you have Wordsworth poetry are it's completely on subjective poetry, though there are some, the universal message to audience. His poetry is a documentations of his own personal life. For example, if you read the prelude poem and Michael, or Resolution Independence, or if you read, you know um, his the lyrical ballads, or, and the Lucy poems, you see that his poetry are only meant for, the subjectivities on personal. So that we could see in Shakespeare, I mean, in Wordsworth poetry. Wordsworth's revelations of spiritual presence in nature and its scenes of the people. In Byron, rare forceful sincerity in the luminous simplicities of Blake, in the fairy melodies of Coleridge, and the most of people in the lyric cry the ethereal light of Shelley. But these are comparatively rare moments. The mass of their work is less certain and unequal in expression and significance. The poets like the Blake, Coleridge, and Byron and Wordsworth and the Keats, these poets, they have contributed very significantly for literature. But what about the message that they've given to the whole humanity? Finally, we get in Keats a turning way to a rich, artistic, and sensual poetic speech. Even Keats is known for his very rich and artistic and a sensuous poetical speech, and marvelous in its perfection of opulence. So resource and color, which prepares us for the more various but lower fullness of the intellectual and aesthetic epoch. But even then, so even otherwise, what happened? These poets, they lacked this intellectual and aesthetic epoch that had intervened. The greatest intuitive and revealing poetry has yet to come. So he's still expecting the poetry are not there in the highest realization. These poets, they are never reached the zenith of the supreme level of humanity. They didn't talk about the humanity value based, but much more the poetry were mere to just their intellectuality. They show that how the intellectual poets they were, but what is required? The poetry should instruct the reader. The poetry, it should instruct the audience. It should instruct the society. That is the message between the poet and the society. There is an interconnection. But poets, they were unable to reach that that so-called that philosophical thought. It is a typical Indian mind's response to an English poem. So I told you, Arvindo is an Indian, and his response is towards the English poem, a mind trained in Hindu philosophical thought, because he is basically a philosopher. A philosopher, he always looks at other subject only in terms of philosophically, right? A philosopher looks and he finds out everything in he reads, everything he writes in a philosophical note. Then what happens? And ultimately, and after commenting on English poetry in general, Haribindo focuses the chapters on two important romantic poets, that is, as I told you, the Byron, Wordsworth, and he examines and comments about the Byron and the Wordsworth. So what does he say about the Byron? Sri Aurobindo feels that the Byron and the Wordsworth were gifted with exceptional poetic talent. This is very important, that this is an important notion, important declaration, that what Arabindo feels, both Byron and Wordsworth were gifted with exceptional poetic talent, but Byron's contribution was only limited. His contribution so scanty. You use the word scanty, which means he did not contribute poems in number, more in number. So his contribution is very less. So Sri Aurobindo feels that the Byron and the Wordsworth were gifted with exceptional poetic talent, but both failed to tap their creative abilities to the fullest possible extent. And probably you all Indian literature, the students for of second semester, open elective student, you should you have to focus on this opinion of Aurobindo. Why does he say so this? And why he says that though they were the gifted, the exceptional poet, but both failed to tap their creative abilities to the fullest possible extent. So, what is this fullest possible extent? That means a poet, he's only there to instruct or obstruct some information, some direction to the whole humanity. That you should not forget. For example, you being a citizen, and we being a teachers, and somebody being a responsible position, they have to do their utmost sincere duty. So, what is the duty of the poet here? The duty of the poet is to reach to the fullest extent. Now, what is the duty? He has to give some message to the entire universe. Poetry, just writing for the sake, you can't write. You have written some poem which is filled with the thoughts and feelings. Is it the final always? No. A poetry should dare to instruct or abstract some message to the entire humanity. Then Then what happens here? So this lacuna, Sri Aurobindo traces to the fact that both the Byron and the Wordsworth, when moved by the powers of inspiration, were not in a position to express it simply because the intellectualized language which they employed was not adequate. The language that they used, because Wordsworth language is a very simple. He used a simple diction, simple language, and the language was so simple. Because there is one statement that is poetry like man speaking to man. Its language is a very simple language, very common language, the way even everybody can easily understand. And he just appealed to the audience, appealed to his reader, but not the inner psyche. Because every critic has this, what is called as inward eye, by used by F.R. Lewis. F.R. Lewis used the word called inward eye in his the scrutiny, in his text. If you read his literature and sociology, you understand. A critic must have a critical inward eye. So I think here Aurobindo uses his critical inward eye in terms of analyzing these poets and the use of language. And he say that these poets, the lacuna of the poets is just they were just they just use language, but it is not adequate. The language was not so sufficient in the writing. And Sri Aurobindo sums up the poetic qualities of Byron and the Wordsworth. How does he sums up? He says that the Byron, no artistic values. The Byron was a poet, but no artist, no intellectually shallow and hurried. His poetry are reached to hastily. He winds up the poetry hastily, and there is the intellectually shallow. There was no intellectuality in his poetry. Who's Byron poetry? Which means it's a serious allegation. It is a serious, comment. That Aurobindo he's doing here. So Aurobindo, he says that the Byron, no artist, intellectually shallow and hurried. He is a poet by compulsion of personality rather than in the native color of his mind. And he just happened just for the reason, just to write poetry. It seems he just written, but there is no inner, the value of the writings, the value of poetry, and inferior in all this as respect to the finer strains of his the great contemporaries. He is not an exceptional compared to his other contemporary poets. But in compensation, a more powerful element's force than any of them, and the more in touch with all that had begun to stir in the mind of the times. So they were able to talk about the only this the commonalities of the subjective way of poetries, but still they should have to talk about the contemporary, the values, values of the society. But whereas Wordsworth, he has this meditative frame of mind. If you read his poetry, they appear more like a more like the poet is contemplating, and his poetry are very much meditative and inward and concentrated in his thought, is more often able by forced or brooding to bring out the voice of his greater self. But the flags constantly the brings in a heavier music surroundings of his few greater clear tones, and downs his genius at last in a desolate sea of platitude. And he appears to be only a mere nature poet. That is this, that is the assessment of Aurobindo. This assessment of Byron and the Wordsworth by Sri Aurobindo, it is quite evident, is based on his theory of national evolution of poetry. So what we understand the national evolution of poetry. So these two poets, they just become a national evolution of, they just prove they just become a poets, because a poet, they represent the country, right? They represent the country in a way. So here, the Byron, he says that the assessment of Byron and the Wordsworth, they are just an they just prove the theory of national evolution of poetry. But there's something still, expecting the poetry. They still reach to this humanity. So after the setting a preamble to approach the writings of Byron and the Wordsworth, now Sri Aurobindo's adjudication of Byron's capabilities of being a poet. So Byron's capability of being a poet is quite interestingly and racy in its explication examines this comment. And he says that the Byron's prodigious reputation, a greater and the more prolonged on the continent than his own country. So, though he finds some the demerits in the writings of Byron, he calls Byron is also an exception poet. But that he doesn't deny to say that. So, Arabindo pays tribute to Byron's poetry as an exceptional one, since it brought a freshness to the poetry in general. This is evident in a statement. So I repeat, Aurobindo pays tribute to Byron's poetry as an exceptional one, since it brought a freshness to poetry in general. So because his poetry appears to be a very fresh and exceptionally gifted poet, is he? So he says that he brought to his work what no other poet could give, and what the mentality of the time, unmoved itself by things which it has not sufficient intellectual preparation to grasp, was fitted to appreciate the native elemental force. The personality, the strength of nerves, and the vital feelings of them, which they needed, and which took the place of understanding the vision. So this is the statement given by Arabindo about the Byron's exceptional poetic appreciation. And uh, and after that, in spite of all this, Arabindo, it appears, is not satisfied with the poems of Byron. So he is not happy with the Byron's contribution. He feels such a poetry was effective and useful to the immediate present, but did not lead to the fulfillment of the highest realization of mankind. The only philosophy of Aurobindo is the poetry should fulfill or reach to the highest realization of mankind. This you shouldn't forget in writing your answer. Hope I'm audible and you people are listening. Okay, I believe that. So it was enough for the immediate. That's what he says, that he says that it's enough for a poet to reach to the highest realizations of the mankind. So the first purpose of the poet is to reach this mankind. And he also says that this is quite succinctly seen in it was enough for the immediate thing he had to do, through not all enough for the highest assured immortality. So there are, though there should be a concept called mortality and the immortality concept, but ultimately what matters is the value, the based realization towards the mankind. So Arabindo sums up the qualities of the Byron poetic creation. So how does he sums up? He says that he's exceptional poet, but still he has some. But he still feels that he requires a creative entity still. Regarding verse poetry, Sri Aurobindo observes observations appears balanced. When talk about the Wordsworth, his observation is quite balanced. So what does he say here? He feels that Wordsworth possessed a higher poetic mind to that of Byron. So he keeps high regard towards the poetry of Wordsworth, who Arbindo. He says that the Wordsworth possessed a higher poetic mind to that of Byron. So more than a Byron, he had that higher poetic mind, and gifted with a better poetic creativity. Wordsworth was gifted with a better poetic creativity. Wordsworth poetry, they exhibited sparks of brilliance due to uninspired intellectual mentality. This is very important. The Wordsworth gifted with a better poetic creativity. He had a better poetic creativity, and Wordsworth poetry exhibits the sparks of brilliance due to uninspired intellectual mentality. Haribindo, he tells that William Wordsworth earlier poems exhibited originality and right vision. This quality disappeared into the background as intellectuality grew on him. The flaw in Wordsworth, according to Sri Aurobindo, he is witnessed in the following lines. So he appreciated him. Now he is the major flaw of Wordsworth. What is the weakness of Wordsworth in his poetry? Yet Wordsworth was not a wider thinker, though he could bring a considerable weight of thought to the aid of the two or three great things he felt and saw lucidly and deeply. And he was unfitted to be a critic of life, and he was not at all a critic of life, and of which you could only see one thing with power and originality. You could only see the power, his writing power, and his originality. But there is we could see that he was not a critique of life. For the rest, he belongs to his age rather than to the future and is limited to his view of religion. He only belongs to this 19th century. He is not reached to beyond the age, because some poets are beyond their age. Some poetry which was written in 14th century, like Chaucer poetry, they're very much applicable to the current life too, because such is the the hope. Chaucer, he's a genius poet. His poetry are universal, and they were not stick to particular period or era. They belong to the entire the era of this universe, and they were not confined to a particular time. That was Chaucer poetry. But whereas if you look at this poetry, the Wordsworth poems, and what happens, he belongs to his age rather than to the future, and is limited in his view of religion, society. And there is no issue of religion at all. There is no issues of society in Wordsworth poetry, of man by many walls of convention. But the word religion is missing in his poetry. But what the poet sees and feels, not what he opines, is the real substance of his poetry. And he opines that still Wordsworth, his substance of poetry are very much restricted. They are restricted in nature. They are restricted very much in it. And now, after that, Arabindo, Arabindo is all praise for Wordsworth's ability to comprehend the serene, tranquil, infinite, the soul of peace. So, but still he admires, still Arbindo, he admires the writings of the Wordsworth, and he praises Wordsworth. How? Wordsworth's ability to comprehend the serene, the beautiful and tranquil, infinite, the soul of peace. So you get to see that the serene beauty of the nature, the tranquility and the soul of peace, an intimate voice that speaks of nature, comprising the flora and the fauna, which, according to Sri Aurobindo, is the first spiritual revelation of this high, was kind to which English poetry have given voice. So that's the reason why in this statement we understand that Aurobindo has put high regard to Wordsworth poetry. He says that his poetry are intimate voice that speaks of nature, comprising the flora and the fauna, which, according to Sri Aurobindo, he is the first spiritual revelation of this high was kind to which English poetry had given voice. So it is also interesting to note that the fact that the Wordsworth does not talk about the nature in its wildest, dynamic, or tumultuous aspect, because he treats nature, he glorifies nature, but he doesn't talk. He doesn't. The nature in a wildest manner, nature in a dynamic manner, because he just feels that nature is the best solace for a human being. If you read his poetry, he just adores nature, but there is no concept called wildest, dynamic, or tumultuous aspect. So Sri Aurobindo also opines that one should read shorter poems of Wordsworth in order to look for Wordsworth share the poetry of quality. If you read his shorter poetry, his short poems shows that his how this poet, he was more intellect and more the poet as a poet, the poet of a quality. And here, in terms of Wordsworth, does not give consistency as a virtue. And here he doesn't put forth his opinion very clearly. And he says that Aurobindo comments on Wordsworth poetry, saying that, but elsewhere he rises high, sometimes astonishingly high for a few lines, but cannot keep long to high poetic expression. Wordsworth doesn't keep the highest poetic in expression, and sometimes can sink low and sometimes astonishingly low, even to both, even to especially when he strains towards an excessive simplicity, which can become the verse. So here we can see that we could only see his highest poetic expression, but not beyond that. And as I told you, if you look at his shorter poem, you could see his intellectual ability. For example, there is one poem called the Daffodils. If you read his poetry, you understand his how he simply glorifies nature, how he simply shows the poetic exuberance. For example, this is the line. I read the first line and the last line of the poem. That's you all. I think you all have read the poem. That is, I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw her crowd, a host of golden daffodils. He's glorifying, he's amidst of nature, and he saw that the golden daffodils beside the lake, beneath the trees, the fluttering and dancing in the breeze. And the last line he talks about, for oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, and they flash upon the inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. So I know the words of poetry definition, that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful the passion or feelings. I repeat again, the poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. This is the definitions of recollected in tranquility. This is the definitions of Wordsworth poetry. And the way, if you read that, if you read the poem that is the daffodils, you could see that how he talks about the minute object of nature, and how he one with the nature, how he surrendered himself to the nature, because nature is the best harmony, or the tranquil friend to him. So the last, how Sri Aurobindo sums up the qualities of Wordsworth poetry. So how he sums up the qualities of words of poetry here? He says that the while when the inner light shines the only out, it admits him to secrets of the very self-revealing voice of nature, herself speaking through the human personality. If you read his poetry, words of poetry, the nature itself speaks to the human being. So that is the keen observing assessment of Aurobindo. He says that the nature itself is voices too, and the ourself to speaking through the human personalities. You feel as though nature is talking to the human being. That's the feeling that we get when we read his poetry. In some closest intimacy with her or else, uttering the greatness of an impersonal sight or truth. He has trans he you could see that the intelligence, the colored veils of imagination, and the poetic speech and the rhythm becomes hints of the eternal movement, and the eternal stabilities, voices of the depth, rare moments of speech direct from our hidden immortality. So here, words of poetry, they appear to be more in number, more in nature, than the society, or the towards the highest, the poetic spirituality. No, that because by poems should always will have some kind of the poetry should instruct the reader. They should have kind of realization. The poetry should must have some spiritual, philosophical essence in his the notion. That's what Aurobindo he talks about in his future poetry, and he tells that both the Byron and Wordsworth, they lacked in their own way of dealing the poetry to the highest spiritual life. So this is the entire essay by Aurobindo. Dear students, as you know that when you understand this text especially, these are the question come to your mind. Could be like what are Aurobindo's observations on Byron and his poems, and after that you have what are the visions of Aurobindo's in the future poetry, and what future directions and development of poetry here Aurobindo is talking about. And in conclusion, we will be able to see that Aurobindo's criticism is an encompassing activity which does not begin and end itself. It was Aurobindo's gift and his intention to create for us an inspired word, the music which he believed and had the potential of transformation consciousness. Poetry has some sort of potentiality in transforming the human consciousness. Okay, and this is the entire essay by Aurobindo. And the other questions that you have in your materials, that the questions could be for your exams, like what according to Aurobindo is the essence of poetry. And after that, the how the evolutions of nations poetry, that you can think about with keeping in your mind that the romantic poets. And after that, you have this, delineate the grounds on which Aurobindo views the history of English poetry. Okay, because he's a philosopher. Okay, he's a spiritual leader, he himself, and he observes in every the poetry this kind of spiritual doctrine. So, dear student, this is the entire essay that I discussed on Arabindo's future poetry, that is poets down to. Hope in my deliberations, my discussions were useful to you people, and you people can make use of this for your examination point of view. And in between, any doubt that you have, you want to clarify, you have to talk to the concerned, the department chairman, that I'm Dr. Natraj. You can always contact me. You can talk to me over phone for doubt that you have on this particular essay, for any discussion that you want to make on. And this number is given in the website, and if you go and collect it in the website of our universities in English department. So I wish you good luck to you people. And today is open, this is open elective class on Indian literature too. The way hope you are benefited by this lecture. And we introduce this text with some motto, some agenda, some importance, some with some notion that our students, our learners of the Karnataka or Indian student, they should aware of the how a poet like Arabindo, he put forth this the future directions, how a poetry should be, how a poem should because every reader, every student have the fascination toward the poetry and the poets. So certainly I hope you believe you enjoy this lesson, and you I hope you have to read this original text. Original text should be read by you people, and you read the text and prepare for your examination. I wish you good luck for your examination too. And this is the session. So I'm going to leave this session. If you have any one or two question, you can just put it in the chat box, and that's it. Thank you, people. Thank you very much, and wish you good luck.